The night began like countless others in small-town America, with families piling into cars and teenagers meeting up under neon lights that seemed to promise nothing but harmless fun. It was late July, and the annual summer carnival had rolled into town, transforming an empty dirt lot on the edge of the highway into a maze of rides, games, and food stalls. For two girls, inseparable since elementary school, it was supposed to be just another carefree night before the looming pressures of high school grew heavier. They were 15, full of restless energy, and eager to spend their Friday night the way so many teenagers did, laughing, wandering between rides, and clutching paper cups of soda as the smell of funnel cake lingered in the air. Neighbors remembered seeing them weaving through the crowd together, one wearing a denim jacket and the other in a bright yellow top that made her easy to spot. They carried little cash, just enough for a few rides and maybe a snack, and one of them had tucked her phone into a small crossbody bag. By all accounts, nothing about that evening felt unusual. Friends who saw them earlier in the night recalled that they were in good spirits, chatting excitedly about the Ferris wheel and trying to win prizes at the ring toss booth. The carnival was crowded, loud, and full of distractions, exactly the kind of place where two teenagers could blend into the background without anyone noticing much of anything. The girls' parents assumed they would be home by curfew, the way they always were, and neither family had reason to worry. But just after 11 o'clock, when one mother sent a text asking if they were wrapping up soon, the message went unanswered. At first, it seemed like nothing, a dead battery maybe, or simply being too busy with friends. But when calls went straight to voicemail, unease began to creep in. By midnight, both sets of parents were driving to the carnival grounds themselves, headlights cutting across the now thinning crowd as rides began to shut down for the night. The parents expected to find them waiting near the ticket booth or lingering by the parking lot, but the girls weren't there. Staff who were closing up reported they hadn't seen them in hours. With each person the families asked, the story grew stranger. One food vendor thought he saw them near the Ferris wheel just before dark. Another attendee swore they passed by the cotton candy stand not long after. A teenager in line for the bumper cars claimed one of them had borrowed a hair tie. None of the accounts matched, and none gave any clear timeline. What should have been simple, two girls in a small carnival, was already unraveling into conflicting fragments. Around 1 a.m., one of the parents stumbled across something that made her stomach drop. Near a bench by the edge of the midway, she found a phone lying face down in the dirt. It was her daughter's. The screen was cracked, smeared with dust, but still functional. The last photo saved on it was a blurry shot of the Ferris wheel lights. Whatever had happened, it meant the girls had never left the carnival. Panic spread quickly. Security guards helped comb the grounds, shouting the girls' names as workers shut down the rides. Volunteers grabbed flashlights, searching the grassy fields surrounding the lot. By 2 a.m, the county sheriff's office had arrived, treating the disappearance as an emergency rather than a case of teenagers sneaking off. Officers began taking statements from anyone still lingering. Cars were checked before being allowed to leave the parking area, but there was no sign of the missing girls. As dawn broke, the carnival lot was eerily quiet. The sounds of music and laughter were gone, replaced by police radios and the low voices of investigators marking off areas with tape. Parents who had once thought their daughters were safe within the crowd were now watching as officers logged evidence bags, snapping photographs of the ground where the phone had been found. A ticket stub was located in the pocket of a discarded jacket, later identified as belonging to one of the girls, but beyond that, there was nothing. No shoes, no purse, no trace of a struggle. It was as if the night had simply swallowed them whole. Word of the disappearance spread through the town by morning, waking neighbors with urgent phone calls and social media posts pleading for help. Parents kept their children home, and by afternoon, the carnival itself was shut down entirely, transformed from a place of joy into the epicenter of fear. Local news crews arrived to capture the images, flashing lights from police cars reflected in the steel arms of the Ferris wheel, deputies standing grim-faced near rides that only hours earlier had been full of laughter. The once ordinary summer night was now marked as the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the town for years. No one could explain how two teenage girls, surrounded by hundreds of people, could vanish without a single clear witness. What remained were fragments, a phone, a ticket stub, scattered memories that didn't line up. The family stood on the edge of the empty carnival lot as the sun set again, staring into the place where their daughters were last seen, knowing with a sinking dread that something terrible had happened, and that this was only the beginning of a nightmare no one was prepared for. At first, no one wanted to believe it was serious. 2 girls missing at a carnival. People assumed they had wandered off, maybe met up with friends, or decided to sneak away for a short while. But as minutes turned into hours, that assumption began to collapse under the weight of silence. Both families were now scouring the grounds in mounting terror, calling out the girls' names into the thick summer air, their voices drowned out by the lingering hum of generators powering the rides. It was nearing 2 a.m. when one father flagged down a deputy already on site for crowd control. What had begun as worried searching shifted instantly into a formal missing persons case. Deputies ordered the carnival shut down completely. Ride operators powered down their machines, leaving the midway in near darkness, only streaked by the faint glow of food stall lights. The music stopped. The air, once filled with laughter and bells, now carried only the sound of shouting and hurried footsteps. Announcements echoed over loudspeakers, urging anyone still in the area to report sightings of 2 teenage girls last seen earlier that evening. Some Carnival goers lingered, offering fragments of what they thought they'd seen, but no 2 stories aligned. Witness statements began piling up quickly, and they painted a confusing picture. One couple insisted they had seen the girls near the Ferris wheel around 9 o'clock, eating cotton candy. Another man recalled them near the edge of the parking lot an hour later, heading toward the road. A teenager working a game booth swore he remembered one of them handing over a dollar bill and laughing when she missed the target. The problem was, none of these accounts lined up chronologically, and none offered proof. It was as though the girls had been everywhere and nowhere all at once. The sheriff's office moved fast. Uniformed officers cordoned off the grounds, setting up a makeshift command post in the parking lot. Volunteers were redirected into organized search teams. Flashlights scanned the woods bordering the fairgrounds, while deputies knocked on car windows, questioning drivers before allowing them to leave. Hours slipped by, and still there was no trace. The families, exhausted and trembling, stood under the harsh glow of floodlights, watching officers sift through trash bins, search behind rides, and comb ditches with dogs trained to track human scent. The dogs picked up nothing reliable. By dawn, the carnival looked nothing like the cheerful hub it had been hours earlier. Patrol cars surrounded the lot, evidence markers dotted the dirt, and tired deputies slumped over clipboards. Reporters had already begun arriving, drawn by the headline of 2 local teenagers vanishing at a public event. Cameras captured images of their school photos printed on missing posters, now taped to the sides of booths that only yesterday had been filled with children laughing over stuffed animal prizes. Search efforts intensified as the first day stretched on. Helicopters swept over the woods, while divers were sent into nearby ponds and drainage canals. Every lead was treated with urgency. Someone claimed to have seen the girls get into a red pickup truck, but investigators tracked it down to a farmer heading home with his family. Another tip pointed to a carnival worker with a criminal history, but his alibi checked out under scrutiny. The more leads surfaced, the more they seemed to collapse, each one taking precious time and leaving detectives more frustrated. The families clung to hope, moving between despair and determination as they gave interviews pleading for the girls' safe return. Mothers described their daughters' personalities, one studious and shy, the other outgoing and adventurous, hoping that humanizing them would stir someone's conscience. Fathers stood in silence beside them, their faces rigid, as deputies assured the public that every resource was being used. Yet, as the hours passed, the absence grew louder than the reassurances. By the second night, the carnival grounds felt permanently changed. Yellow tape sealed off entrances, rides sat unmoving against the night sky, and officers guarded the perimeter as though it were a war zone. Evidence techs combed through the area again, photographing scuff marks near a concession stand, lifting fingerprints from railings, and bagging scraps of fabric found in the dirt. But none of it connected directly to the girls. What had once been a place of joy now looked like the backdrop of a nightmare. On the 3rd day, frustration reached a peak. Flyers papered every corner of town, bearing the girls' names and faces. Volunteers gathered in the hundreds, splitting into groups to search abandoned barns, wooded trails, and empty fields. The sheriff's office kept a visible presence, but privately, investigators admitted they had almost nothing solid to work with. There were no ransom calls, no confirmed sightings, no video footage showing them leaving the grounds. It was as though the carnival had swallowed them whole. By the end of the week, the fairgrounds were completely dismantled. The rides were packed up, the booths shuttered, the vendors gone. What lingered was only the image burned into the community's mind: two teenagers who had walked into the lights of the carnival and never walked back out. For the families, each night stretched into torment, waiting for a phone call, a tip, any sign that the girls might still be alive. Instead, all they had were echoes of that night, conflicting witness accounts, and a growing fear that the case was already slipping beyond reach. In the days following the girls' disappearance, the small town found itself thrust into a storm it had never experienced before. What began as a frantic local search soon spiraled into a regional media frenzy. News vans lined the streets outside the sheriff's office, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, feeding updates to stations across the state. Reporters stood in front of the carnival grounds, now deserted and cordoned off with yellow tape, broadcasting stories that painted the community as the epicenter of a chilling mystery. The faces of the two missing girls were everywhere, on television, in newspapers, and plastered across social media. Their school portraits, once displayed only on refrigerator doors at home, had become haunting reminders taped to storefront windows, telephone poles, and gas station counters. Volunteers poured in, many from towns hours away, carrying flashlights and bottled water as they joined organized search parties. Neighbors combed through wooded trails, abandoned sheds, and drainage ditches. Others knocked on doors, asking strangers if they had seen anything unusual that night. Police set up roadblocks, questioning drivers on nearby highways. The effort was massive, but it also carried an undercurrent of desperation. For every trail they walked, every field they searched, the results came back the same: nothing. As the case stretched into its second week, fear began to seep into every corner of town life. Parents held their children closer. Curfews were imposed in households that had never bothered with them before, and playgrounds stood eerily empty. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered over grocery store aisles, others blasted across social media with little regard for truth. People began scrutinizing familiar faces in their own community, looking for signs of guilt where none had been noticed before. Suspicion grew like wildfire. The carnival workers became the first target of suspicion. Dozens of them had packed up and moved on within days of the disappearance, leaving behind only scraps of equipment and unanswered questions. Their transient lifestyles and criminal backgrounds made them easy scapegoats. Detectives tracked several of them down in neighboring towns, but interrogations yielded no solid leads. Still, the community clung to the idea that the answer lay with someone who had slipped away, hidden in the chaos of the carnival's departure. But the suspicion didn't stop there. Strangers passing through town that night became objects of scrutiny. Truckers who stopped at gas stations, travelers staying in motels, even a hitchhiker reported walking along the highway near midnight. Each rumor carried the same underlying fear that someone had watched the girls, waited for an opportunity, and acted before anyone could notice. Investigators chased down countless tips, but none broke the case open. Soon, even neighbors weren't safe from speculation. People who had lived side by side for decades now eyed each other with doubt. One man who lived near the fairgrounds was rumored to have been outside late that night, though in truth he had only been letting his dog out. Another family became targets of gossip when someone claimed to see them burning trash in their yard the morning after the disappearance. Innocent details were twisted into sinister narratives, and the longer the case dragged on, the more the town's unity began to fracture. Inside the sheriff's office, investigators were under enormous pressure. The phones rang constantly with new tips, many little more than dead ends fueled by paranoia. Detectives went door to door, asking the same questions again and again, trying to find a detail that might have been overlooked. They searched barns, garages, basements, any space that could possibly conceal two missing teenagers. But with each fruitless search, the sense of dread deepened. The families watched helplessly as the investigation spun its wheels, knowing that time was the one thing they didn't have. The parents clung to hope, attending nightly vigils where candles flickered under the weight of whispered prayers. They spoke at press conferences, their voices shaking as they pleaded for their daughter's safe return. They promised they would never stop searching, never stop fighting, no matter how much time passed. But privately, those closest to them saw the toll it was taking. Dark circles under their eyes, nervous hands gripping folded flyers, moments of silence that stretched too long to ignore. By the third week, the atmosphere in town had shifted entirely. What once had been a united community effort now felt like a place divided by fear. Rumors no longer just targeted outsiders, but also seeped into the families themselves, cruel whispers questioning whether one of the girls had planned to run away or if the parents knew more than they admitted. The families, already living in torment, now had to endure the sting of suspicion from people they had known all their lives. The carnival lights were long gone, but their shadow lingered over everything. Storefront windows still bore the fading posters of the girls' faces, while reporters continued to hover, waiting for any development that might reignite headlines. The town's once familiar rhythm, kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences, the hum of daily life, was broken. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same question: who took them and why? Weeks after the disappearance, when the leads had dried up and the search parties had dwindled, the town found itself living with a gnawing uncertainty. The families held on to hope, but beneath it lay a current of quiet dread. Each unanswered question added weight to the silence, pressing on a community that no longer trusted itself. The girls were gone, and with them, the town's sense of safety had vanished too. As days turned into weeks, investigators began to focus less on the chaos of the carnival itself and more on the people who had worked there. The staff list read like a revolving door of drifters, seasonal laborers, and contract workers who had come into town with little more than cash in their pockets and a place to sleep in trailers parked just outside the fairgrounds. Background checks revealed unsettling histories among some of them: petty theft, assault charges, and in a few cases, prior arrests tied to drugs or weapons. For a community already on edge, those revelations were enough to ignite suspicion. Parents demanded to know why these workers had been allowed near their children, while investigators sifted through files, trying to determine whether one of them might have escalated from minor crimes to something unthinkable. The spotlight fell on one man in particular, a ride operator who had quietly slipped out of town with the rest of the crew days after the girls vanished. His record included a string of charges for battery and drunken, disorderly conduct. Detectives tracked him down in another state and interrogated him for hours. He admitted he remembered seeing the girls briefly that night, but insisted he had nothing to do with their disappearance. Despite his violent past, there was no physical evidence tying him to the case. No DNA, no belongings, no witnesses who placed him with them at a critical time. He was released, but his name lingered in whispered conversations for years. Another potential lead emerged when witnesses reported seeing a drifter wandering near the carnival entrance that night. Described as disheveled, carrying a backpack, and muttering to himself, he became a figure of suspicion almost immediately. Deputies canvassed nearby bus stations and shelters, circulating his description. When they finally located him days later, he was incoherent, intoxicated, and carrying nothing more than clothing and food scraps. He denied ever speaking to the girls, and investigators could find no evidence linking him to the crime. Like the carnival worker before him, his image was burned into the town's imagination as a possible suspect, even if the case files showed little more than speculation. As theories multiplied, investigators began considering possibilities beyond the obvious. One theory suggested the girls had been targeted for human trafficking, abducted from the carnival under the cover of noise and lights, then whisked away onto the interstate that ran just miles from town. The location, some argued, was perfect for such a crime, crowded enough to distract, isolated enough for someone to slip out unnoticed, and close enough to major highways to make escape fast. But the theory remained just that. There were no surveillance cameras, no eyewitness accounts of a vehicle leaving with the girls, and no confirmed trafficking networks tied to the area. It explained their disappearance in broad strokes, but it left investigators with no tangible evidence to pursue. Another theory pointed inward, closer to home. Some detectives quietly wondered if the abduction had been committed by someone the girls already knew, someone they trusted enough to walk away with, leaving behind their belongings without a fight. That theory gained traction when investigators revisited the phone found on the ground. The last text sent from it was addressed to a local boy they both knew, a classmate who had been at the carnival that night. He was brought in for questioning. Nervous and stumbling, he admitted to seeing them briefly but claimed they parted ways before the ride shut down. His alibi checked out, and there was no evidence against him, but the idea that someone familiar could be involved haunted the families more than any stranger ever could. Forensic teams tried to piece together the fragments of that night. Dirt samples from the carnival lot were tested, trash bins were sifted for fibers and prints. Surveillance footage from nearby gas stations was reviewed frame by frame. Each effort ended the same way, with no new answers. Detectives admitted quietly among themselves that they were chasing ghosts, pulled in every direction by theories that sounded plausible, but dissolved the moment they were pressed for proof. For the families, each new suspect raised a fleeting surge of hope, followed by crushing disappointment. Every time the phone rang, they braced for news, only to hear another dead end had been reached. Their grief hardened into something else, a torment of uncertainty. Was the culprit a stranger who had drifted through town? Or was it someone they passed daily in the grocery store, a neighbor, even a friend? The lack of resolution made every face suspicious, every silence unbearable. By the end of the first month, the investigation had produced thick binders filled with interviews, records, and theories, but no resolution. The carnival had long since moved on, its flashing lights and noisy rides now just a memory. The drifter had disappeared back into obscurity, the ride operator returned to his life miles away, and the families remained in the same place they had started, searching, waiting, aching for answers. Investigators could feel the case cooling in their hands, the trail slipping further away with each passing day. And beneath the surface of official reports and cautious press statements, a quiet fear spread among them that the truth of what happened to the two girls at the carnival might already be gone forever. In the beginning, the case dominated every headline, every broadcast, every conversation in town. But as months bled into years, attention drifted elsewhere. Other stories rose, other tragedies unfolded, and the disappearance of two girls from a summer carnival became less urgent in the eyes of the public. What once was breaking news turned into occasional mentions, then faded almost entirely from the airwaves. The story was never solved, only displaced, buried under newer crises. For the families, however, time stood still. They never stopped searching, never stopped hoping that the next call, the next letter, the next tip might finally lead to their daughters. Each year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, they gathered with neighbors for candlelight vigils. Rows of candles flickered in the dark, illuminating posters that had yellowed with age. Speeches were given, prayers whispered, and songs sung, but underneath it all was the same unbearable silence. No new evidence, no breakthroughs. Just another year without answers. Detectives came and went, rotated in and out as assignments changed and careers moved forward. Each new investigator arrived with fresh energy, vowing to take a hard look at the case, to chase down every angle that might have been missed. They combed through boxes of files stacked in evidence rooms, reviewed witness statements, and re-examined photos. Some even retraced the girls' last known steps, walking the empty lot where the carnival once stood. But without new leads, their efforts ran into the same wall. Eventually, they too moved on, leaving the case to collect dust once more. The sheriff's office kept the file open, but tips became fewer with each passing year. Calls that once came daily dwindled to weekly, then to nothing at all. Even when tips did come in, most were baseless, claims of sightings hundreds of miles away, strangers insisting they overheard suspicious conversations, psychics offering theories that never panned out. Each one gave the families a moment of hope that quickly collapsed under the weight of disappointment. The silence wasn't just cruel. It was suffocating. The absence seeped into every corner of the families' lives. Bedrooms were left untouched, clothes hanging in closets as though their daughters might return any moment to wear them again. Chairs at dinner tables sat empty, holidays passed with forced smiles, but behind them lingered the raw wound of loss. Friends tried to comfort them, but over time, even the kindest neighbors began to avoid the subject, too afraid of reopening pain that never truly closed. What once had been a community's tragedy became the family's private torment. Anniversaries were the hardest. Reporters returned briefly each year to film candlelit vigils, interviewing the families as they spoke of their enduring hope. Their words were heartfelt, but behind their eyes was exhaustion, years of waiting, begging, and holding on with nothing to show for it. The vigils became smaller over time, fewer people attending each year, until only the closest friends and relatives remained. The candles flickered in the dark, surrounded by silence, and the families wondered if the rest of the world had already forgotten. The girls' faces, once plastered everywhere, became ghostly reminders of an unsolved mystery. Posters faded under the sun, some curling at the edges on abandoned telephone poles. Old social media posts recirculated once in a while, sparked by anniversaries or new speculation, but the impact wasn't the same. The community had moved on, yet the families lived in a world where the clock had stopped the night their daughters vanished. Each photo, each memory, each silence was a reminder of the life that should have been but never came. The families hired private investigators when they could, but each effort ended the same way. Promising leads fizzled, theories unraveled, and every time they reached the end of a road, they were left facing the same abyss of unanswered questions. Some nights parents sat awake in darkened living rooms, staring at walls filled with photos, maps, and notes, trying to piece together the puzzle themselves. They read every article, revisited every theory, obsessed over the smallest detail, refusing to let the trail die completely. 5 years passed this way, 5 birthdays missed, 5 sets of holidays spent with empty chairs, 5 years of questions that never found an answer. By the 5th anniversary, the case had become less about finding what happened and more about enduring the silence. Detectives admitted privately that without a body, without a confession, without evidence, the odds of resolution were slim. Yet the families refused to give up. They spoke of hope not because it was easy, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The Carnival was long gone, its lights and sounds a memory that belonged to another life. The lot where it once stood had returned to weeds and dirt, but for the families, it remained sacred ground. They returned there every year, standing in the silence, staring at the place where everything had changed. For them, the Carnival wasn't a memory. It was a wound that never closed, a mystery that refused to fade. And in the unrelenting silence, the question remained as haunting as ever. How could 2 girls simply vanish into the night and leave nothing behind? 5 years after the night that changed everything, the case was little more than a painful memory for most people in town. The girls' faces had faded from storefront posters, their names rarely mentioned outside of anniversaries. To many, the story had become just another unsolved tragedy, filed away in the back of their minds. But for the families, the ache had never gone away. And for investigators, the case file remained open, even if only in name. What no one could have imagined was that the silence was about to be broken in a way that would drag the entire community back into the nightmare. In the spring of the 5th year, an abandoned storage unit went up for auction in a neighboring county. The facility had dozens of units, most rented by locals who used them for furniture, boxes, and seasonal items. But this one had been neglected for months. Rent had stopped being paid, and by law, the contents were now property of the storage company. Like many such auctions, the event drew bargain hunters hoping to find something valuable hidden in the dust. The winning bidder was an ordinary man, a part-time reseller who often purchased storage units, sorted through the contents, and resold whatever he could online. At first, the unit seemed unremarkable. Inside were boxes of mismatched kitchenware, piles of old clothes, and a broken dresser leaning against the wall. Dust clung to everything. He worked slowly, pulling items into the light of the hallway, making mental notes of what could be sold and what would likely be hauled to the dump. But as he reached the back corner, beneath a stack of boxes marked books, he uncovered something that stopped him cold. 2 backpacks sat side by side, coated in dust but clearly out of place among the junk. They were small, the kind teenagers carried to school or outings. Each bore stitched initials that matched the missing girls. At first, the man thought it might be coincidence, but when he unzipped them, his stomach dropped. Inside were belongings frozen in time, a Carnival wristband, faded but intact, a bracelet one mother had described in interviews years earlier, and a cell phone with a cracked screen, long dead but unmistakably belonging to one of the girls. He stepped back, shaken, realizing what he had found. Without touching anything else, he called the police. Within an hour, deputies arrived, sealing off the unit with tape as though it were an active crime scene. Word spread quickly, and soon the parking lot was filled with flashing lights, reporters, and onlookers who had once thought the case would never resurface. For the first time in years, investigators had something tangible, objects that placed the missing girls not just at the carnival but in someone's possession afterward. Detectives carefully logged the backpacks as evidence, photographing every angle before moving them to the forensic lab. The items inside were cataloged one by one. There were hair ties, ticket stubs from the carnival rides, small trinkets that friends recognized from the night the girls vanished. None of it made sense. Why would these belongings be locked away in an abandoned storage unit, hidden miles from the town where they disappeared? The storage facility provided records of the rental. The unit had been leased under a false name, with identification that later proved counterfeit. Payments had been made in cash for nearly 4 years before abruptly stopping. Investigators quickly realized that whoever had rented it had gone to lengths to conceal their identity. It wasn't the work of someone careless, it was the work of someone determined to hide something. For the families, the discovery was a devastating shock. On one hand, it confirmed what they had always feared. The girls hadn't simply walked away. Someone had taken them, kept their belongings, and hidden them for years. On the other hand, the finding rekindled hope that the trail wasn't as cold as it seemed. If the backpacks had survived, maybe answers still existed somewhere. But the pain was immediate and raw. Seeing their daughter's possessions again after 5 years was like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. Reporters swarmed the story, broadcasting footage of the storage unit with grim urgency. Interviews replayed the family's heartbreak as they begged for renewed attention, pleading for anyone with knowledge of the unit to come forward. Social media lit up once again with theories, names, and speculation. The case that had once been fading into silence was now alive again, thrust back into the public eye with more intensity than ever. But beneath the rush of activity and attention, one chilling fact lingered. The backpacks raised more questions than they answered. There were no signs of the girls themselves, no DNA that suggested they had ever been inside the unit, no evidence of what had actually happened after that night. The belongings confirmed they had been taken, but not where, not why, and not by whom. It was proof that someone had been out there all along, hiding pieces of the truth, while families searched in vain. The storage unit, filled with dust and forgotten junk, had become the sudden epicenter of a nightmare thought buried. For detectives, it wasn't just evidence, it was a doorway reopening to a case many feared would never move forward again. And for the families, it was a cruel reminder that their daughter's story wasn't finished, and the answers they had waited 5 years for might finally, painfully, be within reach. The discovery of the backpacks shattered the stillness that had gripped the case for years. Detectives who once believed the trail had gone cold were now energized, moving with a sense of urgency that hadn't been seen since the early days of the investigation. The storage unit evidence, though fragmented, gave them leverage they had never possessed before, real, tangible proof that the girls had been deliberately hidden away after the carnival. It was no longer speculation. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal the truth. Forensic teams combed through the unit with painstaking detail. Dust was brushed away, fibers collected, and every box, drawer, and scrap of paper examined. Among the clutter, analysts found handwriting on the inside cover of an old notebook. Scrawled in black ink were initials, a name, and a string of numbers that didn't immediately make sense. When compared against old employment records tied to the carnival, the handwriting bore striking similarities to one man, a ride operator who had been questioned in the earliest days of the investigation. He had slipped away quietly when the Carnival packed up, his record littered with assault charges and transient addresses. He had always been a person of interest, but no evidence had ever linked him to the girls, until now. The discovery reignited suspicion, and investigators quickly pulled his file back from storage. He had last been traced to a trailer park 2 states over, but that address was years old. Detectives fanned out, searching for traces of him, old acquaintances, pay stubs, any breadcrumb that could lead them to his whereabouts. Partial fingerprints lifted from the storage unit's lockbox added weight to their pursuit. Though degraded, the patterns matched samples taken from his employment file. It wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to paint him as the central figure in a story that had haunted the community for half a decade. The town buzzed with the revelation. For residents who had whispered his name for years, the evidence confirmed what many had believed all along, that he had been involved from the start. But finding him was another matter. His trail vanished as though he had evaporated into thin air. Former co-workers recalled him drinking heavily, talking about leaving the Carnival life behind, but no one could say where he had gone. Some claimed he fled to the West Coast, others believed he was hiding under a false identity, still drifting from job to job. A darker rumor suggested he might already be dead, buried in anonymity somewhere, taking the truth of the girl's fate with him. For the families, the news was a brutal mix of hope and anguish. On one hand, there was finally a name tethered to the evidence. On the other, he remained a ghost, always just out of reach. They had lived 5 years in silence, and now they were told the man who might hold every answer was gone, impossible to find. It felt like chasing shadows, grasping at something that slipped further away the harder they tried. Investigators leaned on federal databases, searching for his fingerprints in employment records, criminal arrests, and border crossings. They checked shelters, hospitals, and morgues across multiple states. Occasionally, a tip would surface, a sighting in a truck stop, a rumor from another carnival, a mugshot resembling him in a distant county. Each lead sparked a surge of hope before fizzling into nothing. The cycle became maddening, a cruel pattern of near answers that collapsed into disappointment. Meanwhile, the families faced an unbearable reality. They could stand in front of the cameras again, clutching photographs of their daughters, begging for the fugitive to come forward, but they had no assurance he ever would. Candlelight vigils took on a sharper edge, their prayers now directed at someone specific, a man whose absence felt like a deliberate taunt. Mothers asked themselves if he was watching from afar, seeing the pain he caused. Fathers wondered aloud if the man who might have taken their daughters was already dead, robbing them of the truth forever. The media ran with the story, amplifying every rumor, every potential sighting. Talk shows debated whether the carnival worker had orchestrated the abduction alone or been part of a larger scheme. Online forums exploded with speculation, dissecting his past, poring over every scrap of information. But beneath the noise, investigators were left with the same emptiness that had defined the case for years. They had evidence tying him to the storage unit, but no proof of what had happened inside it, and no body to put on trial. The sheriff spoke carefully during press conferences, stressing that the suspect remained a person of interest, rather than naming him outright. It was a legal shield, a recognition that until they had more, all they possessed were fragments pointing in his direction. Still, the message was clear. The man who had once slipped quietly out of town was now the center of everything. Weeks stretched into months, and the pursuit stalled. No matter how hard detectives pressed, the man remained out of reach. And with each passing day, the families felt the weight of being pulled closer to the truth, only to have it snatched away again. The discovery of the storage unit had promised answers, but instead, it had delivered another layer of torment, a suspect who could not be found, a shadow that reemerged only to vanish again. 5 years after the girls disappeared, the community found itself standing in the same place it had always been, haunted by questions, trapped in silence, waiting for a resolution that always seemed to hover just beyond reach. And in that unbearable distance, hope and despair coexisted, each one clawing at the other as the shadow of a vanished man loomed over them all. Detectives had already pulled the backpacks from the storage unit, but the unease in that room lingered. Something about the way items were arranged, the deliberate stacking of boxes, suggested there was more to uncover. Crime scene technicians worked slowly, cataloging every object, lifting latent prints from dusty glass, photographing even the most mundane scraps of paper. Then, near the back wall, half hidden beneath a sun-bleached tarp and pushed behind broken furniture, they found something that immediately shifted the tone from curiosity to dread: a large trunk secured with a rusted padlock. The trunk was dragged into the open, its surface scratched and dented as if it had been moved countless times. When the lock was cut and the lid forced open, a heavy silence fell over the room. Inside was a collection of items that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Rolls of duct tape and lengths of rope were piled neatly, some used, others new. Plastic bags contained articles of clothing too small for an adult, and scattered across the bottom were Polaroid photographs, their edges curled with age, but their images horrifyingly clear. One detective lifted the first photograph carefully, holding it beneath the stark overhead light. The instant image showed a young girl, her face pale, eyes wide, illuminated only by a dim bulb that cast long shadows on a bare wall behind her. She looked terrified, her expression frozen in panic. Other photographs revealed similar scenes, close-ups of frightened faces, some blurred by motion, others so sharp they felt invasive, almost intimate in their cruelty. The most devastating discovery came when several of the Polaroids were recognized. Two of the faces were unmistakable: the missing girls, alive after the night of the carnival. The room fell silent as officers processed the magnitude of what they were holding. For 5 years, the families had lived in torment, not knowing if their daughters had survived beyond that night. Now there was proof they had, but no answers about how long they lived or what horrors they endured in the days or weeks that followed. It was confirmation and heartbreak all at once. The photos did not stop with the two girls. There were others, faces investigators could not immediately identify. Some appeared to be of children, others of young women, all in similar dimly lit settings. It raised terrifying questions. Were these victims connected to the same suspect? Were there other disappearances that had gone unnoticed, unsolved, buried under the weight of cases written off as runaways or accidents? The trunk, once just an object, had become a window into something much darker than anyone had anticipated. Detectives began to piece together a theory. The storage unit was not just a place to hide belongings. It was a trophy room, a carefully maintained archive meant to preserve control over the crimes committed. Each item inside the trunk was deliberate. The tape, the rope, the photographs, they weren't discarded tools. They were remnants, souvenirs kept to relive the terror inflicted. The very act of hiding them in a locked unit behind layers of junk suggested meticulous planning. This wasn't the work of chance. It was ritual. Forensic analysts rushed to process the evidence. The rope and tape were swabbed for DNA. The Polaroids were scanned, enhanced, and cross-checked against databases of missing persons. Investigators hoped desperately that fingerprints or biological material might connect the items directly to the suspect they believed rented the unit. But even as evidence was logged and sealed, the emotional weight of the discovery pressed heavily on everyone involved. Detectives described the photographs as some of the most disturbing they had ever encountered, not just because of what they depicted, but because of what they confirmed. The girls hadn't disappeared into nothingness. They had been taken, held somewhere, terrified and alive, before vanishing again into silence. News of the discovery hit the families like a storm. For years, they had clung to hope that maybe their daughters had survived, that maybe they had run away or been living under assumed names somewhere. Now that fragile hope was shattered by the reality captured on film. Their daughters had been alive long enough for someone to photograph them, to manipulate their fear, and then discard them like forgotten objects. The photographs were both proof and torment. Parents who had begged for answers were now forced to confront the cruel reality that the truth was far worse than their imaginations. The public reaction was explosive. The story dominated headlines, not only because the missing girls had been thrust back into focus, but because the photographs suggested a predator who had possibly claimed more than one victim. Communities across multiple states began re-examining their own unsolved cases, wondering if missing children or teenagers might be connected to the shadow now looming over the carnival disappearance. Yet for all the shock and horror, the discovery still left the most important questions unanswered. Where had the photographs been taken? Were the unidentified faces in the Polaroids victims from other towns? And most hauntingly, where were the two girls now? The trunk gave investigators chilling confirmation of their suffering, but no resolution about their fate. It was both a breakthrough and a dead end, a cruel paradox that left everyone staring at the same haunting images, knowing the answers they contained were still locked away. The storage unit had given up another layer of its secrets, but with it came only more darkness. For detectives, it was proof they were chasing not just an abductor, but someone who operated with methodical precision, someone who collected terror like others collected keepsakes. And for the families, it was confirmation of their worst fears, that their daughters had been alive long enough to be remembered by a lens, but perhaps not long enough to ever come home again. The discovery inside the storage unit should have been the turning point, the moment when years of silence finally broke into resolution. But as weeks turned into months, the truth proved far more elusive. The photographs were horrifying, the fingerprints suggestive, the backpacks undeniable. But the one thing investigators needed most remained absent. No bodies were ever found, no physical trace of the girls beyond those belongings and those frozen images. It was as if the trail, once revived, simply disintegrated again into the same void it had always been. Detectives pursued every angle. Forensic teams scoured the trunk for DNA, comparing strands of hair and skin cells against national databases. They analyzed the Polaroids, searching for clues in the shadows, the texture of the walls, the faint glow of the light bulbs overhead. Specialists examined the film itself, estimating the time period when it had been produced, narrowing down when the pictures might have been taken. Each step brought theories, but none brought certainty. The images confirmed the girls were alive after the carnival, but how long they survived and where they were kept remained locked away in silence. The prime suspect, the carnival worker tied by handwriting and partial fingerprints, became the center of an intensive manhunt. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were contacted. Old acquaintances were interviewed again, their memories combed for overlooked details. But every lead collapsed. He had no active bank accounts, no current address, no paper trail to follow. It was as if he had vanished deliberately, dissolving into the transient world he had lived in all his life. Some investigators believed he was still alive, hiding under another name, moving from job to job unnoticed. Others whispered that he may have already died, taking the truth with him to an unmarked grave. For the families, the revelations were unbearable. For years they had clung to hope, imagining that somewhere, somehow, their daughters might be alive. The photographs stripped that hope away, replacing it with anguish and unanswered questions. To know their daughters had been alive long enough to be photographed, but not to know what came after, was a cruelty no parent should endure. Each vigil became heavier than the last. The candles burned as they always had, but now the images of the girls' terrified faces hung over the gatherings, a reminder not just of absence, but of suffering. The case officially remained open, but behind closed doors, detectives admitted to one another that without bodies, without a confession, there might never be a resolution. Prosecutors knew evidence like photographs and fingerprints could point to involvement, but without the girls themselves, it would be nearly impossible to secure convictions. And so, the families remained trapped in a purgatory of sorts, given enough proof to know their daughters had not simply vanished, but not enough to know where they ended or who was responsible. The community bore its own scars. What had once been remembered as a place of laughter and neon lights was now defined by the absence of two young girls. The carnival never returned. For years, the dirt lot where it had stood remained empty, avoided by locals who couldn't walk past without feeling the weight of memory. Parents still told their children the story, not as entertainment but as warning. Never disappear from sight, never wander too far, never trust too easily. What should have been a symbol of joy had become a monument to fear. Reporters revisited the case on anniversaries, bringing the same questions to the families and investigators, only to leave with the same answers. The girls were gone, the suspect missing, the evidence incomplete. Online forums kept the story alive, dissecting the photographs, speculating about the storage unit, arguing over whether the girls might have been part of something larger. But even in the digital echo, there were no new truths, only theories circling the same void that had consumed the case from the beginning. In the end, the storage unit became both a breakthrough and a heartbreak. It proved the girls' nightmare didn't end at the carnival gates. It gave their families the devastating confirmation that they had been taken, terrified, and held somewhere against their will. But it also stopped short, offering no closure, no justice, no grave to visit, no names to charge. The photographs lingered as evidence, but also as torment, forever freezing the girls in their final hours of fear. 5 years after the disappearance, the community was left with a haunting truth. The mystery was not solved. The case stayed open, files stacked in cold storage, waiting for a break that might never come. And every summer, when the air filled with the sounds of distant fairs in other towns, this community remembered the night their own carnival became a place of tragedy. The laughter, the lights, the music, all of it overshadowed by the unanswered question that refused to die. What really happened after that night?